This is Chapter 5 of the State and Local Government course, and we've just got through talking about elections, so now we're going to move on to the next topic, which is political parties, interest groups, and campaigns. So we've got quite a bit to talk about. What are the goals of the political parties? And we will be looking at the overall general U.S. political system, as well as focusing on the state level. The political parties are the people that are seeking office. They are running for these positions in order to make the decisions of government. And from the party's perspective, they are trying to win control of the government because, as we'll see, in a two-party system where one party is going to hold a slim majority, they will have an advantage to get policy passed, so therefore very influential in policy making, particularly if they have that majority. And political parties are also trying to maximize the vote of their party members, as well as try to rationally suppress the vote of the people in the other party. Primary functions of political parties is what we're doing here is aggregating lots of various preferences of people into a coherent platform that will attract the most voters in order to get them to win the majority of that particular legislative body. And so parties, as we'll see particularly with campaign finance, are bearing the costs of bringing this coalition together of like-minded people to a certain extent in order to win control of the government and pass policy in their view of the world. And in the U.S. system, since we have two major political parties, then people can pretty much proclaim their membership or loyalty to a particular party ideology and then move themselves up through the ranks of the party, perhaps to a national level. So therefore, the party would serve as somewhat of a farm team system to recruit and nominate candidates for offices. Now in the U.S. system, from state to state, we have two major political parties. Overwhelmingly, probably about 1/2% of all the legislative people in the United States at all the state legislatures are a member of one of the other party. The Republican Party is typically the conservative-minded party that are more adhering to traditional values as far as right versus wrong and authority, that sort of thing. Republican Party typically looks at a government having somewhat of a limited role. And of course, there is, again, a lot of exceptions to these things because whichever party feels strongly about something, well, then they're going to get government involved in that. And the Republican Party, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, has kind of moved to the side to where they are supporting the business person, big business, corporations, things like that. Democratic Party is the more liberal side, or in this case, the progressive side of politics, looking a little bit more open-minded to change and taking somewhat of an activist role for government to perhaps proactively try to solve problems. And while the Republican Party has typically supported businesses and corporate efforts, things like that, the Democratic Party has over time, particularly since around the Industrial Revolution, has been more in support of organized labor and the working man, minorities, things like that. Now this is a chart from 2015, and it probably hasn't changed dramatically since that time, but what we've seen, and we talked about it in the last chapter, is that close to about a third of Americans are going to be very loyal and dedicated to the Republican Party. Another approximately about a third of people are going to be very loyal and dedicated to the Democratic Party. But what we've seen, because of the polarization and contentiousness of politics in the last couple of decades, particularly, or even just in the last decade, even more dramatically, we've started to see an increase in people who are declaring themselves independent. Now, what we also have to keep in mind is that the majority of those people that are claiming to be independent still lean one way or the other. And we'll talk about why it is that they would have an incentive to vote either Republican or Democrat rather than for a third party. We'll get into that. But only about 10% of the entire electorate is truly independent, where they could be what is referred to as the swing voter that could literally swing the election from one party back to another, that sort of thing. So let's talk. This is the book does not get into this in too much detail, but this is important to try to understand how and why the United States has this two-party system, and particularly when things are fairly polarized and unproductive. Well, then we might want to ask ourselves, how did this get here? We understand a little bit better. Now, the Constitution, unfortunately, has got a few things written in it that are conducive to the two-party system. These are the structural reasons why we have a two-party system. One of them we've already talked about. Well, we've actually talked about both of these as far as structural reasons. And one is the single-member districts. We know that if there's only one representative that's being elected from each district, there's only motivation for two viable candidates. And that's been studied quite a bit, and we see that in proportional representation systems, if you have multi-members coming from that one district, you're going to have motivation for more parties to try to win some of those seats. Theoretically, it's been shown that, for example, if you have 4 people that are being elected from that district to go to the chamber, well, then you would theoretically have at least 5 parties that would compete for those 4, because by the time you get to that 4th seat, you're still going to need 2 parties to compete for that last seat. And since we only have one representative, there's really motivation for only 2 candidates, and once those major parties have gotten into place, then they have other things that they can do to stay in power. But we've also talked about the Electoral College. We know that if it requires a majority to win the electoral votes, then if you have 3 viable candidates, you are most likely not going to have a majority winner. And so therefore that discourages a viable third-party candidate. Otherwise, it could be thrown into the House of Representatives on quite many times, because you would not have somebody getting a majority. If you only have 2 viable candidates, then you're pretty much assured that one of them is going to get the majority and then be president. So those have been in place since day one in the Constitution. And they are very much probably at the heart of why we have a two-party system. So that would require constitutional amendments, perhaps, if we wanted to reform this system. But over time, we've also seen that the states have evolved to enact what we call these winner-take-all rules, to where whoever wins the majority, or in this case, the plurality of the state's popular vote, will get all of that state's electoral votes. And that gives the states more power in election, because if we're just going to divide it up, then what would be the difference than just using popular vote and have a proportion go to the winner, that sort of thing. This way, the state can wield some clout and say, if you need to pay attention to me, Mr. Presidential Candidate, because if you win my state, even if it's by one single human being, if you win my state, you're going to get all of my electoral votes. So that has also kind of entrenched the 2 parties into power. Another thing that this is very important on the state level. We know that the state legislatures are tasked in the Constitution to come up with those states' voting systems, and that means also drawing their congressional districts. So states have to redraw these districts every 10 years when a new census comes out, and the party that's in power at the time of that redrawing of the census will have a very big advantage in order to get the new district map approved so that they can stay in power. What I mentioned before is what they can do is pack as many people as they can into one district that is going to be their opposition so they can concede perhaps one district, but then they're going to crack up all the other districts so that they can ensure that each of those districts is going to get a majority of their vote, and so therefore then continue to maintain their majority in that state's congressional delegation as well as their House legislative delegation. And it works. There's been numerous examples to where of course, the Republicans have been doing this more egregiously. Both parties will do it, but the Republicans have been caught a few times and actually slapped down by the higher courts on this. But for example, when you only get 48% of the popular vote, but yet you're getting 60% of the seats, that shows that gerrymandering works. It's an effective tactic in order to keep that party in power, but it's also serving to entrench the two major parties that we have staying in power. Psychologically, we like the preference of just an either-or choice. It's been our tradition. If reform attempts were made to try to create a multi-member districts or multi-party systems, Americans would probably be opposed to that in general just because we're not used to that because of tradition. So that's another thing that's holding us back is our preference for the way things are. And we also like things easier. It facilitates our decision making if we only have two choices to make. It makes things easier, and I can decide yes or no, either or, that sort of thing. Now, it's very difficult for third parties to gain any traction because of our two-party system. Those two parties can do lots of things. They can absorb the platforms of a third party and make them irrelevant. They can siphon votes from them. Well, one of the big fears, of course, is that if a third party is an offshoot of a major party, they may pull some of the votes from that major party and cause them to lose. And there have been some cases of that, particularly Ross Perot's third-party candidate was contributing to George H.W. Bush losing the election in '92, and there has a little bit of evidence that Ralph Nader's votes pulled some away from Al Gore in the 2000 election, and that one was so close it more than likely did make a difference. So the big parties really want to avoid these third parties even getting in the mix because it could be pulling votes from them. And what we also see is that lots of third parties are single issue type parties, whether it's for the environment or for some sort of particular issue that they're sprung up around. Green Party, such as that sort of thing. Libertarian Party, which is looking at just pretty much getting government out of our lives altogether, that sort of thing. So if they're not single issue, then they're going to be short-lived. And obviously third parties are going to have fewer donors because donors realize that it's going to be a long shot for them to sustain and actually get big enough to where they can compete with the two major parties. So there's less resources. We also know that many states, particularly that are controlled by one of the other parties, they will establish ballot restrictions so that third parties can't even get on the ballot because they can't get enough signatures to get that person on the ballot. And the winner-take-all vote means that if a state is spread out over around the entire country, might not even be able to win a plurality in any single state. because what we've seen, the only third parties that have really ever won any electoral votes are concentrated in a couple of states where those states feel like that's a part of popular third party, and then they will win the plurality of that state and get a few of those electoral votes, but clearly much fewer than they need to win. And then the concept of wasting your vote. This means that even the independent people out there, if they vote for a third party, they know they're voting for somebody who does not have a chance at all in winning, so therefore they're technically wasting their vote. This is rhetorically. And they can either decide to vote that way just in principle, or they can say, well, let me vote for one of the two major parties because then I know my vote will have more of a chance of mattering. Now, the political parties are organized from all the way down to the local level, even factional local groups that could then merge with a local party committee. And this is a chart right out of the book that shows a couple of, for example, a permanent party structure that starts with a local precinct organization and then proceeds up to a county committee and then a state committee. Or then you could have a temporary structure set up to where a county convention can be called that elects delegates to a state convention. This happens quite often during the presidential primaries, where state conventions will pick people to go to the national convention and actually contribute to a platform that will then be established at the national convention. So no rule as far as what has to be done. Each state kind of does it a little bit differently. Each party within that state may have a different type of organizational structure. Here's a couple of websites for Bergen County Democrats, Bergen County Republicans, state level NewJerseyGOP.org and NewJerseyDems.org. So those are the state level organizations there. Here's the county level organizations there. You can check them out and see what they're doing, asking for donations, perhaps a listing for volunteer help, things like that. Now, as far as party loyalty goes, we already know when we talked about in the last chapter that loyalty to a party is the single biggest predictor of how people will vote. We know that about 2/3 of Americans are loyal to one of the other parties, and they will vote for that party regardless who the candidate is, without fail. They are voting for an ideology, or what they perceive that conservative or liberal party represents to them. So you've got straight ticket voting that would appeal to that type of person, or ticket splitting, where if you want to look at on a office by office basis. Divided government simply means that the governor's office or the governor is a different party than the legislative majority. And divided government is not necessarily bad. We've seen in the past that a divided government has more effective policy coming out of it because there's more deliberation required in order for these parties. It might even be divided between the House and the Senate at the state level. And that would require a little bit more compromise and deliberation to get policy out. And a unified government means that the same party controls all of particularly the legislative branch and the governor's office. And so therefore you've got, percentagely, or I guess you could say statistically, more likelihood that you're going to get more policy passed during that session because you're going to have less opposition to getting it shot down. But of course you also have to worry about the possibility of getting very ideologically stacked policy being kind of rammed through because they've got the unification there, and it might be somewhat railroading some policy past the minority party. Now we do see that particularly amongst the younger generation, a little bit of de-aligning, or I guess particularly if you haven't even declared an affiliation to a party, then you may not align with one, but you are seeing some evidence because of the polarization and the dissatisfaction with our political organizations solving, or the lack of their ability to solve problems. We do see a lot, well, perhaps a little bit more of a trend of people de-aligning from their party. That's why we saw that increase in the independent voters. Here is 2015. It hasn't changed dramatically from this map here. I'm sure we can find one to update this, but this is just telling us as far as the state legislatures, the state governments. We see that there are considerably more states that are controlled totally by the Republican Party, and fairly middling number there as far as states that are split between parties as far as that goes, and then relatively few that are controlled by Democrats. So that also reflects demographics in geographics, because we see the coastal regions, particularly the highly populated regions, coastal regions, are a little bit more conducive to a, being more acceptable to a liberal or progressive type of governance because of more populated areas, more interacting areas that are people are having to be a little bit more tolerant of each other in order to keep those highly populated areas running smoothly. A little bit more deference to government taking care of some problems, a little bit more proactive government in order to do that. So there's some logic to that as to why we start to see this divide between rural America or less populated America and more populated America, as far as how that's dividing between our two-party system. Now let's talk a little bit about interest groups, because these are a very important part of our American democratic political system. The interest groups are the benefit seekers, whereas the parties are the office seekers that make the policy. Well, the interest groups represent various areas of our society, various economic sectors and institutional sectors and social issue groups, things like that, and they are coming together. They have a shared goal in mind or a shared preference, so they come together in these groups, pool their resources, and use that louder voice in order to get benefits. And it's fairly effective. It does get a lot of criticism because interest groups do have a disproportionate voice in getting policy passed in their favor. And this is what we call the concept of pluralism, somewhat like a polyarchic type of system where policy is driven by competing groups. So good, bad, right, or wrong is beside the point. It's these interest groups that come together with like-minded people who have the same goals in mind. I want this benefit for my professional association or for my corporation or for my social group, and we're going to collect dues and do certain things that are going to get government's attention, campaign contributions as well. We're going to get government's attention disproportionately, and they are going to pay more attention to us. That's why interest groups are called the workhorses of political advocacy. They're the ones that are actually motivating things to get done, because the average person who sits around and votes once every 4 years, or not, because we don't vote very much, well, they're not really, the policymakers aren't really paying a whole lot of attention to them as far as passing bills and whatnot. They also know that they have a good chance of getting reelected anyway. So it's the interest groups that are kind of driving things, and therefore they have that unbalanced, disproportionate influence. I'm going to break this down a little bit differently than what the book does. We've got three basic types of interest groups. The economic groups are by far the most prominent and most influential. Economic groups include the corporations themselves, such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, AT&T. They are their own interest groups. They can do lots of things to try to put pressure on government to get lower corporate taxes, to get subsidies, to get advantages here and there. So corporations, businesses, financial organizations such as the banks and financial institutions and professional associations are quite prominent in America. There's virtually no profession in the entire United States that does not have a professional association that is affiliated to it. Its sole purpose is to raise money and to look for benefits to government to help that profession succeed. And labor unions are less prominent than they used to be in America, particularly as we've moved more towards pro-market fundamental principles and less government intervention in the economy, that sort of thing. Of course, that wavers depending on what's happening. So labor unions actually represent the workers, whereas the corporations represent the owners and the shareholders for the most part. And so there's a big divide there, but labor unions are part of this economic group, which is by far the most numerous groups out there that are lobbying government, and by far the most influential because of the resources that they have and the ability to get government's attention through lobbying and campaign contributions. The institutional groups are the groups that are usually driven by budgets, and so they're looking to increase their budget or looking to improve their agenda. So all the bureaucracies also are lobbying within government. The bureaucratic agencies are lobbying the congressional bodies to make sure that they maintain their budget levels to get benefits as far as providing their jobs. Colleges and universities are a very prominent institution that lobbies state and local and federal governments for grants and things like that. Cities, states, international organizations, these are all types of institutional groups that are, for the most part, not driven by profit, but they may be nonprofits, they may be agencies that rely on a budget. We know New York City is a big city that needs lots of help, and it lobbies the federal government quite a bit to get funds and grants and subsidies and that sort of thing to help New York City handle its business. Now, promotional groups are the ones that we probably hear the most about, the ones that get media attention. These are the issue groups, the religious or ethnic groups, the recreational groups. Here we're looking at things like the NRA, which gets a lot of press as far as advocating against gun control measures. We have Sierra Club looking at environmental issues. We've got NAACP looking at discrimination issues. We've got AARP that's looking at benefits for seniors. So these are the three basic types of interest groups. And when we go down to the state level, they have a little bit more of a variation. On the federal level, we'll look at some numbers here in a minute. The federal level, you pretty much have the same types of groups that are lobbying Congress and the presidential elections through every cycle. They vary from the state because in the state, if you have relatively weaker parties, you may have stronger interest groups and vice versa. But again, the similarity, regardless of what level we're looking at, state, local, or federal, it's the business interests that dominate. Chamber of Commerce is the biggest contributor to lobbying expense, particularly at all levels. And so Chamber of Commerce represents small businesses all over America. So Chamber of Commerce is lobbying local governments, state governments, and federal governments in order to try to get benefits for the business person out there, small businesses and the business persons out there in the world. Industry groups, trade associations, which is just another type of professional association, banks and financial institutions, utilities, labor unions, professional organizations. These are the preponderance of influence is through those types of interest groups. And here, the 20 most influential interests in the state, as you can see: general business, Here's a labor union, school teachers, utility companies, manufacturers. Uh, Most of these are associations, insurances. Oops, didn't mean to do that. And medical associations, contractors. As you can see, the professional business associations, and there's a few institutional groups here. And but here's another labor union there. So as you can see, the predominance of interests there that are influencing state governments. Now, as you get further down at the local level, cities pretty much just have to maintain business. We got to get the potholes fixed. We got to keep the street lights on. We've got to enforce parking tickets, things like that. So you've got just the day-to-day business that you have to do at the local level. And so interest groups are focused more on service delivery. What kind of services are being delivered there? Again, the business interests. We've got neighborhood organizations that are a little bit more active, obviously, on the local level. And then because things move so slow on the federal level, on the local city level, you have a little bit more preference there to get direct action through your interest group efforts. So interest groups do lots of different things. Depending on how big the interest group is, they can get government's attention just because of their sheer size. They can threaten their people to vote against you. They will get your attention through media campaigns by hiring, well, we'll talk about lobbyists in a minute, but by just direct access to the legislatures, because they can collect more funds and they can use those funds to help out the legislative person or contribute to their campaign. So lobbying is a very effective technique. We'll get into that a little bit more detail here in a minute. A lot of people don't quite understand that, but it's very rational behavior for these professional associations to hire lobbyists, these corporations to contract out lobbyists to help them get their benefits. What some groups can do is protest and get attention, media attention. They can boycott certain products to get attention. Labor unions in particular can strike in order to get attention for what their needs are. And then we'll talk a little bit more here about campaign contributions, because that's another fairly, an investment. These are investments that interest groups can do in order to get benefits back from the legislators who, even though they may not acknowledge that they're getting these campaign contributions or this lobbying assistance, it's human nature that they are going to remember it, even though they don't acknowledge it. And that will affect, particularly in the next re-election cycle, will affect the benefits that they will pass on. Lobbyists are hired by the interest group to represent them to try to get those benefits. So it's not, even though there's a lot of opposition or controversy over the lobbying system, there are rules. People occasionally do cross the line into bribery, but for the most part, it's a rational concept in that the lobbyist is working with the congressman as an ally on any particular proposal. And it's not likely that they're going to change a congressman's mind. What they're going to do is target and work with congressmen that are already sympathetic to their needs and then help them with that policy. In some cases, even just help write the legislation in the first place and give them rough drafts in order to shape what the eventual congressman is going to have to approve. And so the lobbyists are very much more specialized in these particular policies, whereas the congressman is more of a generalist because he has to look at so many different policies in so many different areas of our society. So therefore, a lobbyist provides him useful information and resources to serve kind of as a specialist in helping that congressman get that policy out the door. And of course, the congressman has to use his judgment as to what the final thing's going to look like. But he's obviously going to be grateful for that help and future help as well. So, as we've seen, perhaps as predicted, we are seeing that these interest groups and the effect of lobbying has exploded at the state level. It's been growing dramatically at the federal level and now starting to catch up on the state level as well. Here is just some fairly mundane type of techniques that you would see that a lobbyist would do as far as helping out a congressman and getting the work done to get policy that's passed that helps their client, their interest group. As far as the top spenders on lobbying so far this year, as I said before, Chamber of Commerce is at the top of the list every year, and here you see professional associations, realtors, pharmaceuticals, insurance companies, hospital, medical associations, airlines, Amazon, Facebook. So you can see every single one of these in this group except for one, which is a nonprofit human rights democracy type of think tank. But every single one of them in this list, other than that one, is an interest group, is a economic interest group. Now, campaign finance has been getting more and more intrusive into our election process. There's a lot of controversy about that. Is campaigns get more expensive? Are we actually getting better legislators? No, doesn't look like it's actually correlating with that. But there's lots of avenues for professional associations and even groups who come together to create these committees and groups for the purpose of raising money to contribute to their candidates. Political action committees are very common. Lots of associations and corporations and utilities, whatnot, have political action committees to where the group or the corporation has got a captive audience, right? So they contribute to the PAC, and that PAC uses that money to distribute campaign funds to the politicians that they need to communicate with in order to try to help out their long-term goals as far as benefits go. 527 groups is just another type that's tax exempt, engaged in political activity. 501Cs are a little bit more controversial. They're nonprofit. They're called social welfare organizations, and they don't have to disclose their donors, and they're also tax exempt if the political activity is less than 50%. These have been scrutinized quite a bit because some of them are just fronts for pure political activity with really no social welfare at all. So that has brought up some controversy. The super PACs were formulated after the 2010 Citizens United decision, which allowed unlimited expenditures into campaign spending as long as that money was not coordinated by the candidate. So it was separate expenditures. That's why they're called independent expenditure committees. Most of it, is used for negative campaign advertising, which does have an effect on our system one, human brains. Here's some examples from 3 states of the highest spending political action committees. Here you see an education association. This is Alabama, a business council, farmers association, and a power company. Here, because Iowa is the state that's got the first primary caucus in it, the Republican and Democratic parties are the biggest spenders there, as well as government association, general contractors, realtors. Here in Texas, we got a group for lawsuit reform. We also got realtors. We have also got a health PAC and AT&T. So these are just an example of political action committees at the state levels. Hard money, that is where we have rules that limits how much an individual can give. This is to will it prevent the possibility of one super rich person giving billions of dollars to one candidate so that he can have that person pretty much be a puppet for him in running the country? So even though that may not specifically happen, we also want to limit that possibility of having one person giving a lot of money to one particular candidate, and then there would be certainly some potential bribery or obligations attached to that. Soft money is where the amounts are unregulated, particularly because parties and certain groups and committees can spread that money out. So as long as they're spreading that money out to various candidates, then those what we call soft money, not as much limits on them. And we do know that the contributions are for a reason. We want the more contributions we give to a legislator, the more expecting that legislator to vote in our favor as far as on that policy goes. That's rational behavior, good, bad, right, or wrong, like it or not. That's kind of how our system has evolved. And if you want to reform it, then you got to get smart, get out there, figure out how to reform the thing. So media consultants are hired even more increasingly to target voters and frame the political agendas in order to try to make these campaign contributions and these expenses a little bit more efficient, right? To try to maximize what they're going to get back for their money. And as I've said, with the super PACs, negative ads are extremely popular because they appeal to our lowest common denominator of emotions, fears. People remember the negative ads a lot more than other ads, and so therefore a lot of money is spent on that. And we are kind of putting ourselves into a position where we feel like that we need more and more money to win. That may not necessarily be true if there were other things in place, but elections are getting more and more and more expensive. Total spend in 2016 election. This is literally just on the national level. It's going to be quite a bit more than that when you add in state and local. But $6.5 billion just in the 2016 federal elections alone, and we will look at 2020, and it will most likely be a significant increase. So one of the things that reformers are looking at to reduce cost of campaigns is to pass disclosure laws so that more and more associations and PACs and whatnot and these political committee groups have to disclose more of where their money comes from and who it's coming from. Also, the possibility of increasing the number of limits on contributions and more laws that are monitoring campaign finance. So there's lots of things that are being looked at as we see. Some states have already got various things in place. New York corporations are limited to $5,000 max per year. Florida has a $500 per candidate per election limit, and few states here have allow no contribution for corporations or labor unions. So we've got quite a dramatic mix here. Missouri and Oregon have no limits at all. So that's part of our federalist system, is that states vary from each one to determine how they want to handle their own campaign finance and elections. We know that public funding is another option where that would also include limits. This could be such as on your IRS federal tax form, a check off to where you would actually pay no additional money. That money would come right out of your taxes, or you could do a state tax deduction that would actually pay for campaigns, or have more potential candidates that would necessarily be conducive to spreading the money out, that sort of thing, and trying to narrow the gaps between candidates to level the playing field, public funding. So there's lots of ideas out there. It's just the political will to do those things. And here are some some websites there that are looking at campaign finance and that sort of thing.